10 in the morning, Bambos.
I'm so happy.
How did you get up this early? I'm talking to myself. I've got my coffee. This is the first coffees. I can't drink coffee at 5 p.m. when we knew our normal time of the show.
I'm so happy.
So-
I've always wanted to do a breakfast show with you because I think it's fun.
I know. I think breakfast show is great, but then we miss out on everyone in America because they'll be asleep by the time. And there's a lot of viewers over there as well.
Exactly.
We are on with Vera-lee Curnow. No W, a silent W. And we're going to be discussing her and her podcast, Why Not? And it's a journey of recovery. And she suffered from everything imaginable. So we really are going to be discussing recovery.
I love how you say it with a big smile. She suffered from everything imaginable.
We'll get into it. I needed to look at like dictionaries to see all these words because there's so many words there that I'd never heard before.
As soon as you press the song, go get a hat.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to do all of this and much, much more. Where Bambi Bambos?
On the wonderful Chaos, Mr. Shalev.
Here we go.
Go.
I put on my Steven Spielberg hat for the show.
It's our Spielberg. What's the Apple guy?
Steve Jobs.
Yeah, Mr. Jobs.
You know, I had someone walk up to me at an airport and said that to me. I had it a few times actually. Do you know you look like just like because I used to have his glasses as well.
Can you imagine?
It's pathetic. Vera-lee. So Vera-lee I got as well from the internet. In my internet searches.
It's like a online dating site, but you go.
It is like an online dating site. Actually,
you swipe people.
I kind of swipe and I look for, of course, the story that I think I'd be interested in discussing that for an hour.
I'm really happy you're interested in discussing someone being sick all the time.
Yeah, this is sick week. It's like Shark Week, except for us, it's sick week. It's, you know, I don't think that Vera has had any organs replaced, so she won't have that story like yesterday. But
like,
there's a lot more going.
How is it for you getting up and doing a show? Because normally you like to leave the house around this time.
You know, I usually have done 10,000 steps by the time we're now on the show, at least in the last 3 weeks. So what I did instead was I've already booked a whole trip up the western coast of the Netherlands.
What do you mean you booked?
I mean, I booked the hotels. I'm going to be walking the entire coast of the Netherlands. Not the entire, let's say the majority of the coast, starting at the hook of the Netherlands and walking all the way to Den Helder over a 6-day period. I already mapped the whole thing.
Wow.
It's incredible. So we'll discuss that at some point.
Are you taking your wife with you?
For the first 2 days. And then I thought we would negotiate after that if you wanted to join at some point. So there would at least be some possibility to tag along if you were interested.
I'll probably put my running shoes on and...
Yeah, you'd run back and forth as I'm walking. I know that. You're going to be like, Andy, only 4 hours in a day, you know? Like you're going to get up in the morning, run out to the ocean. You probably force me to do like a dip in the...
I would never force you. Like when was the last time I forced or imposed my way of living onto you?
You know what you do? You're very persuasive. Let's put it that way. So if you're running in the ocean and I'm like, you know, you'll be in the ocean naked. I know it. I see it before me already. For a morning swim, it's freezing cold outside, you know, and you're in the water. I just, that's painful for me.
Can we talk about my sex life for a second?
Yes, we can. Let's segue to something more interesting.
So I did meet someone eventually, but not because of the podcast, by the way. And the dilemma has been, she's a woman that's married, separated, but is still with the guy.
Yeah.
And so it feels like every time she's visiting me, it feels like she's also
betraying her thing.
She doesn't feel like she's betraying her thing, but it's more like she's. I need to go home now.
It's a home, and she's sleeping in the bed with another man, I'm assuming.
You know what? We've only been seeing each other for 10 days, so I didn't open up that conversation. But
I know, but it's still uncomfortable, regardless. No.
Yeah, but I'd rather. So my thing this morning when I woke up, I thought I'm gonna just ask, because if I don't ask, I'm going to create stories in my head.
Sure.
And then I'm going to project.
It just feels very complicated, Bambos.
Let it go.
I don't know. I mean, it just as I hear it, there's got to be. We have to have some offline discussions around more details because we can't discuss everything online, I guess. So there are things I'd like to ask, though.
Nice.
But interesting, your sex life. I'm curious to see where that one unfolds to. Yep. Yeah.
How's your sex life?
Not so active at the moment because I go to bed and my whole body is so sore after walking 25,000 steps a day that I feel like I'm lying in bed like, oh my God, like just my body is saying, Andy, it's protesting everything that you're doing to me. So for the last period, I've been losing a lot of weight, about 1 kilo a week, something like that.
You look good. Like if I put a picture of you, a screenshot of you from
a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Yeah, it's very different.
Your face you've definitely lost now. Yeah. You didn't have a beard, right?
I did not like this, no. So yeah, that's where I am at the moment.
Nice.
And speaking of health, Vera-lee. I always like a hyphenated first name because my mom's name was Mary Kay, right?
Oh, you have to say both of them, Vera-lee.
Yeah, Vera-lee is her first name, as far as I know. It's not like a hyphenated marriage name. It's a hyphenated first name.
Oh, I get that.
And I always think when I hear her hyphenated first name, like it like harks back to like older years, like mom Mary Kay, right? I don't know why she had two names, but it was always Mary Kay. You wouldn't call her Mary.
So shall we make a bet? It could be that it's her mother.
No. Oh, no. It's her name. I'll bet you, but it's her name. I can see her nodding in the background.
I know it's her name, but where it came from, why too? Vera-lee.
Because that sometimes people got names. My mom's name was Mary Kay. That's a name, Mary Kay. Mary Kay Cosmetics.
Should we bring her on?
You know what? Before we bring her on, let me just fuck up all the diagnoses that she's had. She basically, from a very young age, had to overcome a lot of adversity. So, when I think to myself, in my present state of living and being at peace with most things, the one thing I see that really sucks is when I don't feel well. Right. And I'm like, if I had to feel this way the rest of my life, that would suck. Like, that's the one thing. Like when we talk about gratitude, one of the first gratitudes I'll always say is health. Like, I'm grateful that I'm healthy.
Yeah.
And so when I'm thinking to myself from a very young age, before anything, but just by birth, that you would have certain things you'd need to overcome, like what a shitty place to start. And so I asked her, and I won't remember. So she's from a very early age has Osgood-Schlader's bone disease in both knees. And I can't even pronounce the blood disorder. I'm not even going to try because she's told me how to pronounce it. But
eosinophilic.
No, she pronounced it really effortlessly, and I can't remember the asthma. So when she speaks, she's also got a vocal cord dysfunction that was diagnosed in her late 30s. So she'll cough sometimes, and we might take a break. But outside of that, like that's just her health side. And then on the personal side, she's been in a marriage with abuse. She's had PTSD and domestic violence and sexual assault. I mean, her list is like a crime sheet, but the other side of the crime sheet.
Love it.
Yeah, exactly. So, and she, in spite of that, said, "Hey, I'm doing a podcast called Why Not?" And I'm going to share how I overcame all of this. And I thought really cool to have a talk with her just about that journey. So this is a journey of overcoming. Yeah.
Should we bring her on?
Yeah, we're going to bring her on.
Without further ado, here she is.
Hello. Which diseases did I fail to also include in my intro?
Yeah, so eosinophilia.
Eosinophilia.
It's like a list of accomplishments.
Eosinophilia.
It sort of is. Well, a lot of people are calling me the adversity queen because I really do have this extensively long list of things I've had to go through. And there's a lot more behind that. There's bullying. There's there's so much.
That was the first thing that came to mind, by the way. I lived in Australia for a year and plus a bit. I went to Sydney University. and I'd never experienced such a masculine, uncomfortably masculine society. With all my travels,
but towards the dark side.
Towards the dark side.
It's not like a presence, consciousness.
And when I read this and knew that you were in Australia specifically, I had discomfort arise in me, because I thought, oh, that's exactly the place where there's such lack of compassion in my experience.
Very interesting. Sydney, for me, I'm not originally from Sydney. I'm from Melbourne, and Melburnians, as we call ourselves, we have often got that view of people in Sydney. They seem to be a very standoffish lot, whereas in Melbourne, you're more likely to have people walk past you in the street and actually wave and say hi, or actually open the elevator door for you and things like that. Where I live now, which is a rural town of New South Wales, oh my gosh, completely different again. Like, people will almost be jumping across the road to say, hey, hello, I don't know you yet. Nice to meet you, you know. So, yeah, I think it depends on which area of Australia you're in. I mean, the country itself is amazing. And like everything, there's wonderful people everywhere.
Yeah, obviously. I actually worked on the sheep and cattle station, and I got the roughest part of the society. You know,
you did.
I took the dad took me out and grabbed me by the shirt and said, "Don't go out with my daughter." Like, that's what I remember really well from that time.
Back then, though, he was not the Andy that you see now. He was suppressed. He was not dealing with anything. He was running away. So I don't blame him.
I don't blame him either, of course.
So
good initiation, though.
I do have a question, because, like, the first thing that came up for me is, if your body is having so many diseases, like it feels like it's not at ease with the things happening to it, what prevents you from ending your life?
You know, that's a really good question, and I don't know that anyone's actually asked me that question phrased that way before, so let me see how I go answering that. There was one time in my life where I considered ending it all. This was before I had a child. This was before I was married, and in fact, before I'd even had a relationship with anybody. And this was when I was clinically depressed. I was diagnosed with clinical depression. I'd gone through a very difficult situation in my career, which I'd spent all of my life up until that point setting everything up to step into this new career that I was so passionate about. And there was a certain situation which I can't publicly talk about. However, there was defamation and some things going on. And it felt like everything was just pulled from under me. And I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to seek help from. And I wasn't getting support that I needed. I certainly wasn't getting it from the place where I was working at the time. And so for me, there was one moment I remember distinctly, driving down a highway. Unfortunately, I had actually had some alcohol, which is not something that I traditionally do. I don't usually drink alcohol. That particular night I had alcohol. I was driving to a particular event that I was required to go to as part of this job. And I just didn't want to be there, and I didn't want to be anywhere. And I remember thinking, if I just veered over to the left a little bit, if I just, went over and hit something, then it would all be over. And then I thought, I can't do that, because for that to work, I'd have to go into oncoming traffic. And for that to work, somebody else is going to get hurt. And I could never choose to be responsible for hurting somebody else. I'd been through already at that point in my life a lot of pain from different people, and I certainly wasn't going to inflict that upon anyone else. So to answer your question, empathy, compassion for others, love, and connection with others. And even though at that moment I felt very disconnected, I still knew that I was in there somewhere. I still knew that even though I felt disconnected to myself, I could find myself again if I was willing to look, to seek out myself. And so that was what I did.
I really loved how calmly you answered that question. Like, I could feel the words as you were speaking them.
It's interesting. To Bambos, it's interesting because I wouldn't have asked that question.
Do you know what happened?
What?
Oh, I did drive the car off the cliff.
Yeah, but this is what I was going to get to, is that I was asking, I wouldn't have asked that question because I wouldn't have felt close enough to that experience in myself to ask it comfortably. And what I realized as Bambos asked is like, oh shit, Bambos is asking the question because it's so common from his experience that he can access that kind of comfort level. And that touched me as you asked, actually. Yeah.
I guess I should have also what I'm learning on the show is to also share that why I'm asking. And in a time where I was depressed, I did, and I was a drug addict also for 10 years. I did drive the car off the cliff, and having been a failure my whole life, I kind of landed in a tree. So yeah.
So you
Yeah.
felt like you failed that attempt.
I failed that attempt.
It's interesting. It's very interesting question, and I think what you're talking about here, Andy, is that Bambos knows how to hold that space, and that's something that I talk about often.
Yeah.
I do the same with my guests on my show. We talk about really deep, dark moments in their life.
Yeah.
And to be able to talk about that, you need to have a level of comfortability with it.
Yeah.
And you only can get that to hold that space for somebody else if you've been through it yourself to a certain level.
And that, by the way, we spent a lot of time talking about that on this show. And it's not frequently that Bambos can hold space in an area where I also feel comfort. So what I was experiencing at that moment was, wow, he can hold space in that area where I don't see myself comfortable holding space there. And a lot of times the tables are sometimes switched in a way because
I think it's because I'm sitting on your chair.
he took over. We switched chairs. It's confused our audience horribly.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, it's. I mean, go jump right in there. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to be where you are right now, the words which come up for me right now is self-love, without knowing what the question will be. What will be your journey towards loving yourself and loving what is, if you want to take it on a more spiritual, in quotes, level?
Yeah. There's a few ways I can answer that question. So I'm going to explain based on a number of different times in my life. For me, self-love has evolved. It has changed. It's a very flexible and almost pliable thing for me. So back then, if we go back to that moment, I had self-love. I knew my worth to myself, and I felt like I was fighting against everybody else around me at that time. My family and close friends accepted, but I wasn't geographically close to them at the time. So I felt like everybody else around me was fighting against me and giving me this opposite view that I wasn't worthy, and I knew I was. And so for me, I was at war, it seemed like, with the world. And so although I knew my self-worth and I loved myself, I didn't understand why everybody else seemed to be on a different page with me. If we talk about other events that have significantly affected me and my own view of self-worth, you mentioned about the domestic violence relationship I went through. This person was my husband. This was supposed to be the love of my life. And yet he not only sexually assaulted me repeatedly, he did just about every form of domestic violence that you can think of. It was right across the board: financial abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse. The physical abuse came in the form of sexual assault. I mean, the list just kept going. There was the isolation. It was an awful, traumatic experience. And as I explained to people, I was a very articulate person. I, had been through a Bachelor of Applied Science and teaching. I was an educator. I was a very empathic and compassionate person. And yet I didn't see the signs because I wasn't aware of what domestic violence was. I wasn't aware of how this manipulation was in practice. I didn't think that I knew anybody who'd gone through domestic violence or sexual assault. And I say that I didn't think I knew because I now know the statistics prove that most likely half the people I knew had either gone through something themselves or knew somebody close to them who has, but people weren't talking. And so because this wasn't a conversation that I was used to being around, I was used to hearing or even participating in, when I got to the point where I realized this was what was actually happening to me, I was already so emotionally invested in this person, I didn't know where to go from there. And the systematic cutting off of people from your life meant that when I explained the brutal rape for the first time, that I literally tore my soul from my body to survive, to be able to act as a protection for what I had to endure in that moment, I then didn't know how I could reach out to other people for support. And so in those sorts of moments, although that was a protective mechanism that I became very good at using later on, it also created a significant disconnection from myself to myself. And so my level of self-worth and my level of self-love was diminishing and deteriorating with every single rape, with every single taunt, with every single name he called me under the sun, with every single time that I felt fear in that relationship, with every single time I felt trapped and I felt like a prisoner. And so that stage was very different to the type of self-love that I was operating within for myself, and yet depressed because I didn't know why other people weren't seeing that. Now I was essentially contained in this house in a box with this person who had cut off almost everybody else meaningful in my life and was telling me that I was the one who was crazy. I was the one who was seeing things and not remembering correctly. And, so it was a very interesting and difficult time for me to go through personally, and to work out a way to find myself, find a way back to myself through that. And part of that came through becoming a mother, through that experience.
With that man?
With that man. I have one child, and he was born from that man, that relationship. Now, when I say that to people, they often ask me, do I resent having this child? Did I resent becoming pregnant because I was in this terrible relationship with this man? The thing is, I still was trying to love this man, and I still was trying to believe that he loved me, because why else had we started this relationship? Why else had we gotten this far? And there were moments when he was a very loving man. And the realization came many years later that he chose when to behave and when to misbehave. He chose when to abuse me and assault me. And that realization for me was key in understanding how to get back that connection to myself. That in fact, it was his behavior and his choice to behave that way around and to me. There was some love in that relationship, and that's what I was constantly looking for, until it got to a point where I said, you know what? This is now involving my child, whom I love, who I am so blessed to have in this world. And I will not allow you to hurt my child. And the moment when I changed my mind about trying to make things work, and I realized the only way to survive this was to leave, was the day that he, standing in the kitchen, walked up, or I wouldn't even call it walked, if you can think of an angry ape beating at his chest, tearing towards you. This was what he was doing. He was literally ripping the t-shirt off his body. There was no longer the man that I knew in his eyes looking back at me.
Wow.
And he full on swiped at me and my child, who was a couple of months old at that point in time, and missed us by about a centimetre, half an inch. And at that moment, I froze. And in my mind, things were going a million miles an hour. And I'd already been setting up emergency bags and plans about how I was going to leave and all these things. But at that moment, I was like, that's it. This has to happen now. I cannot be here with my child another moment and have the worst possible case scenario happen, where he would have my child flying across the room and be killed because he had crossed some sort of invisible line.
And you left then?
I left.
Never to return? How did that proceed after that?
Never to return. So he worked as a chef.
Can we, because you've said so much as far as I'm concerned, I want to slow it down a little bit.
Sure.
like you mentioned, he had a story about you, like that you're the one that's not right in the head. Like
Hmm.
how did that play out in your body? Were you able to find your agency, or were you losing your agency in that moment?
A little bit like that other moment when I said that I understood my worth and yet nobody else around me seemed to. And so I was fighting this war. That was what that was like. I was fighting his version of events. I was fighting what he was controlling or trying to control of me, in me, around me. And I was fighting my own memories of what I knew and felt with every ounce of my energy and body to have been the case and to be true. And yet here is this person constantly telling me otherwise. And as strong as I am mentally as a person, as connected as I was or disconnected as I was at the time, I still knew that my version of events was correct. I knew that his behavior was not as he was trying to say and change, and was actually, in fact, what I remembered had happened. And I had lots of evidence for these things. I was keeping journals. I, had the broken plates that he didn't remember breaking. And, I had all these different reasons for knowing. And yet, somehow, there is something that changes eventually when day after week, after month, after year, you're being told that you're crazy. That's not the way it is. What is wrong with you? You need to go and see somebody. There is something seriously wrong here. You start to question your own level of sanity within that.
Wow.
I'm assuming you guys never talked about him getting help.
All the time, he refused.
And when you say he refused, were you able to have a conversation with him? Or
Had many conversations with him at the start when I recognized the red flags, when I recognized behaviors, when I recognized some of the manipulation, although I didn't fully understand what it was. So earlier on, we had many conversations, and usually the response was, well, I don't have a problem. I don't understand where you're getting this. I don't understand why you're seeing it that way. That's not the case. That's not the way it is. Or, oh, well, sorry, sometimes I lose my temper. Well, sorry, I'm really sorry. I don't mean it. I'll be better next time. That's the usual dialogue that most people who've been through domestic violence understand. It's the, yes, I've just behaved this way. Yes, I've created this awful hurt. And I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to get you back. I'll do anything to make it better. I love you. I don't know what came over me. I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. And you do believe that to a certain point. And then you realize when you see the pattern of behavior is not changing and, in fact, is escalating. And in fact, the more that you say, hang on, that's not actually the way it is, the more the behavior escalates and gets worse and worse and worse. And I'm usually very, very good at detecting patterns, at seeing things from a different perspective. And during that period, the amount of onslaught is probably a good word to use for it, of things that were coming from him in every possible way, including energy. I mean, my dad and I often described him as the black hole because that was the energy coming from him when he was like that. It was very difficult for me to remain clear of mind, and I lived in a bit of a fog. And on top of that, because I was going through so much stress, I was put on antidepressants, and that made my fog even worse.
Yeah.
And so it was a really interesting and difficult time to really hold steady to what, again, I knew was true and yet was being told constantly, no, that's not the way it is. There's something wrong with you.
well, you really took me through a journey. Before 2014, I didn't have an issue with violence. Like I just didn't see it. I grew up in it, also in my culture. So as I lived my life, shouting and being verbally abusive was a very normal thing. And it was only until I met Andy, who put a very big mirror in front of my face, and I had to come to terms with how I was living and that behavior was not acceptable. And as you're speaking, I can't help but think about his past. But obviously, we're not here to talk about his past. Um, you've gone through this, and apparently, you also have been having physical ailments happening to you. Where do these two stories tie together?
I started feeling and becoming more unwell when I went through that clinical depression stage. And the thing is, I met him when I was sort of recovering from that particular experience. And so I was in a vulnerable state when I met him. And the fact that our relationship developed and deteriorated, so did my health. So did my illnesses get worse and worse. And it was like a compounding effect. And I often talk to people about how much emotions do affect our body, particularly when we contain them. And so you mentioned before about how calmly I speak about things. I do speak about things very calmly. However, at that time, I wasn't calm. I was in chaos. And yet I was feeling numb. And so I had this push and pull constantly inside of me, like a war, really, where I'm like, okay, I'm this calm person. I have this calm exterior. You know, I like to articulate what I'm talking about. And yet here I am in this insane environment with this really psychotic behavior that I'm having to deal with, where I don't know when it's going to be flown at me or not. It's like walking on eggshells every moment of the day. And even when you do things the right way, the way that you are supposed to do, then there'll still be something that they will pick on for that. And so it's a no-win situation. And so being in that chaos and yet being a naturally calm, logical person was something that I hadn't experienced in my life before. And it took a lot of internal conversations with myself trying to work through that, you know, trying to remain connected with what was left of myself that was still standing after the abuse, you know, that didn't feel broken, because a lot of myself felt broken and beaten down. And so it was about trying to hang on to those things. And people now, they often again term me as the eternal optimist, because no matter what I've been through and all of the different things that just seem to be one thing on top of another on top of another, I've always managed to instinctively look for the positive rather than looking for the negative. And honestly, that is what has helped me to accept what's going on, and in my own mind work out ways how I was going to try and change, or what positive things I could focus on. So if we take another example, my illness got to the point where it was so bad, and I had left him. I'd been quite a few years out of that relationship. My son and I were starting to set up a new life in a different town. I'd started my own business, which was going really well, and yet I was working so hard and so long, and I still was trying to go through this recovery process and unbox a lot of this trauma. I didn't give myself enough space to really deal with that and to have that emotional healing that I needed. And I crashed very, very badly. And that was around the time that I was spending more time in hospital than out. I had to walk away literally from a thriving business where I had employees. And I had to accept that I was in such a physical disarray that I needed to give myself a few years of space to try and heal and try and, you know, get some way of management that I could actually be having some semblance of quality of life. And at that point in my life, I was extremely morbidly obese, super morbidly obese. I'd been on a drug called prednisolone or cortisone, a lot of people know it as, extremely high doses. And so, you know, the weight just kept piling on no matter what I did. That drug can affect very morbid, and I use the word morbid here again, very morbid thoughts and moods. It can flick you over into very depressive states. And there was just so many elements of my body that were breaking down. At that time, I had undiagnosed conditions, so the eosinophilia and the vocal cord dysfunction were undiagnosed at that time. And so we were seeking help. We eventually did get those diagnoses, only to be told that there were no cures at that point in time. Okay. But again, even when I was flat on my back, tied up to machines, keeping me breathing, unable to move anything but my little finger, and usually not even able to lift my little finger that far, I was still aware that my brain and my mind and my imagination were intact. And that was my key to getting through. That was my key to finding the hope. That was my key to keep seeking. That was my key to say, you know what, I may be unable to move here right now, but I can still think, I can still imagine, I can still visualize when my body is well, and breathe life into what I could still do and have left in my body, my physical body. And so the power of visualization and the power of being able to seek the positive had a massive influence on both my recovery physically, emotionally, and mentally.
That's pretty incredible. How do you source the strength without letting your mind take over? Because obviously you're not in a physical state to be comfortable, and then sourcing your imagination and visualize what you want. As you said, you're very easily going to the positive as the negative. So where do you need to go in yourself to do that?
Great question.
Because my name is Bambos and I have no clue how that works.
Well, I think that it works differently for each of us, and it's about finding out what really works for you. And there are common elements that we can all share to help each other. However, the exact recipe for what's going to work the best for you is something that comes from trial and error. And if we go back to the fact that, yes, I was born with some of these diseases, even though not all of them were diagnosed at that time, I grew up with these adversities. I mean, I was wanting to be a tennis champion, and I had this bone disease in my knees where I could barely bend. And so there was lots of things that I wanted to do that life pushed me back and said, no, you can't do that. I'm sorry, we're putting the brakes on here. And so no matter how adventurous and how much potential I felt I had, my body had spent a lot of time pulling me back and saying, no, you actually can't do that. And so what I learned through those experiences was a level of acceptance that wasn't defeat. So it was saying, okay, I accept that at the moment I'm in this state. I accept that my body is not allowing me to do this the way that I want to. So how can I look for another perspective? How can I look outside that box? How can I find a way to make it work? And my family was very instrumental in fostering this way of thinking. This is what we did. And this is how we talked. And the discussions we had was, okay, so we understand that this is a struggle for you. What can we change so that you can work your way around that struggle? Instead of saying, well, here's the brick wall. If we keep going at it, we're going to keep hitting it. And it doesn't matter how often we hit it, it's not going to change. It's still going to be there. It's a brick wall. You can't punch your way through a brick wall. Well, let's look for another way to get around the brick wall instead of going through it. And so I became very good at problem solving and looking at things from a different perspective. Now, people will see behind us our backdrops. So you have one of my pieces of artwork on your backdrop, and I have another piece of artwork. I have always felt connected to creative energy. And for me, the more time that I can spend in that imagination mode, the more time that I can be visualizing color, shape, pattern, the more that they affect my mood. And for me, it was about working out visually what calmed me, what gave me the ability to say, this is possible. What patterns could I see in my artwork that would relate to patterns of behavior or thinking that I was doing. And so for me, it was a way of connecting the dots. And so I used a lot of audio, a lot of podcasts that I would listen to. I value and understand the importance of the resonance of someone's voice, which is why for my own podcast at this point in time, it is only on podcast platforms, because I like people to be able to go into that dark room and take away every other type of stimulation and to simply focus on the human voice and the power of that energy as you hear the words and as you feel those sound waves going through your body, and you can integrate that message that you're getting from that human voice. And I used to use a lot of music as well. So I would have different types of music depending on what I was going through. So when I was at my sickest, I would have a mixture of classical music and heavy metal and alternative music because they were my two loves. And interestingly, they were at both ends of the spectrum, which is what I needed when I was in that space, because somehow that was taking all the chaos and it was taking all the calmness and it was bringing the two together into a beautiful synchronized state that I could go internally, connect with myself in that deep, dark place that only I know. And if you believe in God or another spiritual being, that there was only the two of us in that space. And for me, that was what got me through the most difficult moments, when breathing wasn't a one-part process. It was a two-part process. It was, let's work really, really hard to breathe in. Now let's work really, really hard to breathe out. Now let's repeat. Because that's what kept me alive, and that's what kept me breathing, and that's what kept me here on this earth, to be a mother to my child, to be an artist, to share my love and wonder for the world, to share my happiness that I am still alive, that I'm grateful to be here because I very nearly wasn't 17 times. And these are the things that I draw upon that helps me to see hope even in a situation where most people would struggle to do so. Does that answer your question? I'd like to read you a quote if I could. It explains a lot of the reason I am able to think the way I do. My dad handed me a book called Psycho-Cybernetics when I was 10 years old. And this book was, granted, a little bit over my comprehension level at that age. However, what I gleaned from it, I integrated into the way that I thought, and it made sense to me. And even at that age, I remember having this conversation with my dad saying, wow, I don't know how you got this book or why you got it, but I'm so glad that you gave it to me. And I re-bought a copy of this book because we'd moved home so many times. This book had just found its way somewhere else. We didn't know where it had ended up. It had been lost somewhere along the way. And I always remembered this book, but I couldn't clearly remember everything about it. And so I said, about 5 years ago, I'm going to go and buy that book. And I did. And it sat on my shelf for 5 years. And every day I walked past, I said, I need to read this book. I bought it for a reason. I need to read this book. And so late last year I did. I picked it up and I opened up to a random page. And this is what I read. Creative imagination is not something reserved for the poets, the philosophers, the inventors. It enters into our every act. Imagination sets the goal picture. We act or fail to act not because of will, as is so commonly believed, but because of imagination. And this is the most important statement to be gleaned from this entire book. Human beings always act and feel and perform in accordance with what they imagine to be true about themselves and their environment. So let's go back to me, almost comatose in the hospital, unable to move my little finger. And yet I can imagine. And I can say to myself, I have two choices here. I can succumb to the overwhelming feeling that my body is shutting down and not wanting to be here anymore. Or I can stay and I can fight. And I can visualize when I'm breathing again without the help of all these machines. I can visualize a life when I can walk more than 3 steps at a time without collapsing. I can visualize a life where I don't feel like I'm suffocating every single second of the day. And I can believe that it's going to happen. And even though it's not happening right now, that belief and that in that visualization is what keeps me going through this hard stuff. And that was a random page in the book that I went, this is why I bought this book again. This is why I knew I had to read this book. There is so much of myself that I recognized at that time in my life at 10 years of age that I have integrated into the way that I think, do, and be in this world. And it was nice to reread it and have those reminders. I love creative energy and I love sharing it with people. And that is why I started the Why Me movement, because, and I'll have to correct you here, Andy, the podcast is called Why Me rather than Why Not.
Did I say why not?
Yeah.
I know it's why me. I think I was
okay.
stuck on your last name now and not.
Yes.
Too many variables go in my head.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting.
But why not's not a bad name.
It's not a bad name. It's not a bad name. And, you know, to be honest, when I first launched the Why Me movement, and look, I came up with this concept many, many years ago, and I was too unwell to actually put it into place. And then I was too busy trying to get my life back together as a single mother, someone who was trying to recover from all these things, illnesses and trauma and everything else. It was like life was happening and I was just trying to do my best to hang on for the ride and still be here. And so when COVID hit last year, it gave me an extra 3 to 4 hours every day. And I wanted to put that to good use. And so I finally started the movement. I finally launched it. And the podcast was a natural extension of that. And I had a lot of people ask me, why me? Why don't you say, well, why not me? And because so many people resonate with the why not me? And I say, yeah, I get that. I get the why not me. But here's my perspective.
Sorry. That confuses the hell out of me, what you just said. Because I think I believe everyone resonates with the why me rather than the why not me. Like far more like the victim role. So sorry. So elaborate on how you kind of see that.
Yes. So when I say that people are resonating with the why not me more, it's in terms of rather than asking the question, why me, and instead declaring this is why me. And so when I was explaining the movement to people and when I was explaining the podcast, I was saying to people, the why me doesn't have a question mark. And it doesn't have the exclamation mark because it is why me as one word, encapsulating what it is to be in that woe is me, and then to have the journey to change the way that you approach the world, to stop asking the question, why me, and stop feeling like a victim, and to instead understand what it is that makes you unique and powerful in this world, and that you can grab onto, well, this is why me. And when I spoke about it like that, that's when most people said, well, then it's why not me? And I'd say, well, yeah, I get that. However, for me, again, I'm always seeking the positive rather than the negative, and not is quite a negative word. And so if I say, why not me? Well, then instantly I'm thinking not. So I'm thinking for all the negatives. Well, why not? You know, so I'm going to start looking for the negatives. And this is my perspective. This isn't everybody. Because this was my movement that I was launching, it needed to resonate completely what I was standing for. And so for me, it was why me without a question mark, without an exclamation mark, because it is everything in between. It is accepting yourself when you're at your lowest, most dark moment in your life, and looking at yourself in the mirror and looking at your reflection staring back at you, and actually feeling, I love you. You are worthy. And I'm going to embrace you where you are now, No matter what you feel about mistakes, or, you wish you had done this or we hadn't done that, all the regrets, everything that's led you up to that moment, all the pain, it's about accepting in that one moment, looking at yourself in the mirror, that you have a choice to accept and love yourself and embrace the journey, to decide, what am I going to do from this point forward? Am I going to keep operating in these patterns of thinking and behavior that are not lifting me up? And there's the not. Or am I going to choose to say, this is me. This is uniquely me. I have lived through all of these things, and here I am standing here with opportunity, with potential, with hope, with optimism, and with the ability to choose a new way forward, to choose to seek the positive. And so that is why it's called the Why Me movement, rather than the Why Not.
Thank you.
For me, it sounds like just saying the same sentence with two different pronunciations, which has different meaning.
Pretty much.
Why me? Why me?
Yep.
And then
Why me?
why me? Yeah.
Why me? Correct.
Yeah, you had
And
it
the
with
second why
exclamation
me is
mark.
the embracing.
Had what?
You did it with the exclamation mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Love the exclamation marks.
Vera-lee, our guest yesterday also had as we shared, she had to look for a kidney and she was waiting for that, and she sourced her journey. She gave herself to God, not to a religion, but just to God. And like, do you and you mentioned God earlier, like to what degree did that play a role?
Two very important moments in my life allowed me to welcome God into my life and into my soul, and to provide this spiritual connection that I needed at those times. The first time was when I just had life-saving treatment to paralyze one of my vocal cords. And within 24 hours, I was suffocating and my body was starting to die. And we were on our way to a rural hospital. And my father was there with me. And he was tapping on my wrist to what would or should have been the rhythm of my heart. Boom, 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 boom. And there I was, chaotically trying to squeeze every little ounce of breath that I could on both my in-breath, because my airways were collapsing with my vocal cord dysfunction and the severe swelling in my throat, and with every out-breath, because my lungs were so inflamed and irritated that they were so inflamed and not allowing the air out. And I was focusing on that boom, and he was tapping my wrist at the same time. And the decision was made that there was no way I was going to survive that moment unless I was put in an induced coma. Very, very risky for someone who was in both my state, who had my conditions, and who was my size at the time. And I agreed with that decision, and yet I was extremely anxious, as you can imagine. And look, I'd been through so many difficult situations, and at that time I'd been through 16 near-death experiences. This wasn't like it was the first time I'd ever been here. This one was different. Every other time I had a level of calmness and control that I still felt. This time I was beyond exhausted. I'd already gone through every backup reserve of the backup reserve of the backup that I had. I had nothing left to keep fighting. And yet I knew I had so much worth and value to provide other people as well as myself to stay here. And so I was wheeled into the operating room, and they were just starting to put me under into this induced coma. And I had a vision of my dad's father, my grandfather, whom I'd never met in real life because he'd passed away before I was born. And he said a few words to me. He said, "Vera, you're going to be okay." And at that moment, I felt that God had sent him with the message in a form that I would be receptive to receiving. and all panic, all chaos left my body. And I remember I couldn't say it out loud, but I said it in my head. I believe you. I trust you. Take my soul. Look after me. And let my body do what it needs to do, and let them help my body as much as they need to keep me here. And I succumbed to allow myself to go into that coma at that moment. And when I woke a couple of days later to discover that truly that was the coma I wasn't meant to survive, that was the last time that I asked myself, why me? Why is this happening to me? I'm a good person. You know, I don't feel that I deserve this. Why am I looking around? Everyone else can breathe. They take it for granted. I can't. And I realized I'd been given a second chance. And although I was still in a state with my body, my mind, my perspective of everything had shifted. And I explained to people, when I woke up and they were all worried about pulling the tube out, and I was just like, well, just get on with it. Like, get this thing out of me. I'll be right. And they all sort of walked away, and they were talking with my family because they'd been told to, you know, make all the plans. And they took my family away, so I found out later. And they said, look, we're really concerned that once we pull out the breathing tube, she's not going to breathe on her own. And then we've got another problem of trying to get it back in, you know, and the time that will take with her size, with all of the things that have happened, with her vocal cords being so sensitive. And they did make the decision to take out the tube. And I was unaware of those conversations. I just accepted, I'm here, take out the tube, let's go. Because I had this calmness in my soul. And without that message, I wouldn't have had that. And I don't know if I would have still been here. And I don't believe, and I didn't feel that my soul was actually there when the fight was happening with my body. I believe that I was away. I have no recollection of anything in that time. And I believe that I was being looked after and cared for and loved and filled with that different perspective. That when I did go outside for the first time, after waking up from that coma, the sky had never looked so blue. And the grass had never been so vibrantly green. And I explained to people the sun had never felt so comforting as it did that day. And nothing had changed except my perspective of the world and how and where I fit into it. And so that was my first very, very defining moment with God. After that, I sought a local church in my area. And I had lots of people that were coming and visiting our church who didn't know me. They didn't know my story. They also didn't know that treatment that was actually keeping me alive meant that I had no voice for a 2-year period. So I couldn't speak. When you have a vocal cord paralyzed, you can't speak. And so people were coming up to me and they were prophesying over me, and they were saying, you are going to speak words and life into people all across the world. Speak words, not write them, not paint them and draw them and create them as I was already doing in my artwork, but to speak words globally and life into people. And I believed them. However, my logical brain said, how can I do that when I have no voice? And look at me now. I have my own podcast. I'm interviewing people from all across the world, holding that space for them to share their deep and meaningful moments with the world, for them to provide their insight and their lessons and their perspective on how they've overcome adversity, on how they've seen the opportunities for personal and community growth within and through the adversity as I have myself. It's an amazing journey.
You know, you could have been a hypnotherapist.
Yeah.
one
Maybe
of
in a
our
past life.
one of our, well, with that voice of yours, even one of our viewers, she wrote, Vera sounds so calm, love it.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a comment I get from pretty much every single guest that comes on my show and most of the audience that listen to the podcast. And again, I think that comes from owning who I am, being connected to who I am. And there's a really funny story about my voice that isn't anything to do with the traumas. It isn't anything to do with that stuff. It is to do with me as a 6 or 7 year old little girl who had a voice like this and was so excited about everything. And my dad said to me, Vera, because I went through a stage, I was born Vera-lee, just to get off topic for 1 second, but I promise it's related. I was born Vera-lee, hyphen, that is my name, one name, Vera-lee, Vera-Lee. And I had one particular aunt who was the only person calling me Vera-lee when I was just starting to break into that sort of teenagerhood, you know. And for me in Australia, having a second name like that, particularly a hyphenated name that is actually my one name, is not very common. And so for me, I felt like I needed to be Vera and to drop the second part of my name to be standing into my, you know, growing into adulthoodness. And that was what I thought. And so I politely asked everybody to call me Vera rather than Vera-lee. And she was the last person to stop calling me Vera-lee. And for a long time, I was Vera. And I came back into the Vera-lee quite recently in the last few years because that is who I am, and I connect with myself through every age and stage that I have been through. And I'm very strongly connecting to who I am as a person. And my name is Vera-lee. And so I operate out of Vera-lee now. And at that 6 or 7 years of age, my father said to me, Vera, you need to lower your voice. I don't believe that your voice is actually up where you're talking all the time. And so let's calm you down a little bit and let's allow you to find your voice. Let's get you talking from a lower area rather than up here in your back of your throat. Let's talk from your chest. And so I remember saying to him, okay. And then it was like, okay. And he said, that is your voice. And it took me a long time. It took me years. And sometimes still now when I get really excited, I'm up there. Mm-hmm. My normal register, though, is quite deep. And for a woman, it is a lot deeper than a lot of women speak. And again, the more that I learn about myself and the more I connect to myself and the more I embody that calmness that is naturally me, the more that comes out in my voice. And at my lower register, there is so much more vibration. There is so much more power. And there is so much more emotion and feeling and energy. And I tap into that because that is the level that I like to operate on now.
I want to ask one last question,
Please.
even though we've gone over an hour. Just based on yesterday's show and today's show, what I observe is the way you've gone through your journey. It may, like you feel very embodied to me as you speak. We also didn't interrupt anything because normally if people are more here, we tend to also slow it down and ask questions. But with you, it just was very grounded. And I don't actually know the difference. Like the guest from yesterday felt a little bit more still in the fight phase of her journey.
Well, Vera said it, and I thought what fascinated me, and I thought brilliant, I've never heard it before, is that I'll often mimic and play with the high registered voice that isn't really in its own skin because it has a lot to say, but it doesn't really feel like it's connected to what it's saying. And so when Vera said that, it was really beautiful to see that her father recognized that out of body experience through the voice, and that he called attention to it in a way that wasn't shaming or derogatory to push her down or make her feel like it wasn't also okay, but invited her to look at another way of interacting through her voice and see what that would help her find in herself. And that kind of that's like a beautiful invitation that I'd never really heard or seen through any interactions I've ever had in the past. So that speaks really tons to her father, because he recognized that how to the degree that it was only her voice, or if he was subconsciously figuring that there's more going on, whatever he did, he was helping her ground herself through her voice. I think that's really incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like your family anyway, the way you described them in the beginning. They also had to go through their own journeys to be like the way they raised you, right? The way they communicate with you.
Yeah, for sure. My family are amazing people. They really are. And I ask all of my own podcast guests a number of questions that are the same. And one of those is, who has been an influential person or people in your lives? And it's interesting, so often it's parents. And for me, I was thinking about this the other day. I have so many people who've been very influential in my life, and yet the two constants throughout everything are my two parents. And I'm lucky that they're both still alive and here. And the thing I think that pains me the most about my whole marriage and everything that happened with there was how much disconnection I had from them during that time, and my brothers and sisters, but particularly my parents. I've always had wonderful, strong, deep relationships with them, which allows those invitations to come up in conversation as they are natural.
Yeah.
And so I know how blessed, and I'm very grateful to have had that upbringing. And that was probably the most difficult part of that marriage. Not even everything that I went through when I look back in hindsight, it was that disconnection from the people that helped me be the person I am, to help me find myself.
I think a lot of times when you're going through that kind of domestic abuse, you are so disconnected in yourself that it's hard to make connection with anybody who would even recognize how disconnected you are. So you like stay away from anyone, because it heightens how really disconnected you are. It's a vicious reinforcing negative loop. There were a lot of things. This was a really nice episode. It was funny because normally Bambos and I are switching roles. So I got to be on Bambos's chair, and I learned a lot of things by being in this chair for the show, which was really nice. And we could discuss that as well, because that was really on or off, but it was really nice. I also saw how hard it is from being in your role, right? When I say role, I mean, because when you're channeling the question, so you're completely in compassion and in flow and in sync and feeling into what Vera-lee is saying, that you, right, where I was today, you're kind of like, you're feeling the flow and you're kind of slipstreaming, because I now see you're more engaged. So if I'm going to ask a question, it comes more from a head, or hey, this is of interest to me. But the interest is very different than connecting to what's active at that moment. And I saw that I'm normally in that switched role where, and then afterwards you're like, Andy, how do you do that? And I laughed. I'm like, what? You do it like you just did it.
Yes.
So that was really beautiful to sit, and also to see how hard it is from to be in this seat, seeing you do it and say, wow, okay, now I don't even feel like I want to interact right now, because I see what you're doing, and why would I add anything that I don't see helps facilitate a deeper dialogue? If I'm going to name something, it's probably going to take us out of the flow, because it's not connected to where I see you're connecting with the interaction. So that was really nice for me on this show. I even wrote notes of things I would ask if I was in that seat, and I just didn't ask them, or things that came up for me. I'm like, oh, I would normally say, there was 4 areas I would have said, oh, I wanted to touch on those. And I also feel an unresolvedness and not doing it, which is really nice as well. Like, oh, I would have loved to have engaged that section,
Well, funny enough, I also had those kind of questions, and I wrote them down, but it just didn't come to it.
But while she was speaking, or before?
During the course of this journey, for example, she talked about her ex-husband's behavior.
Yeah.
And I got curious, because when we talk about behavior, it means you you don't see the person as being their behavior, but you see them as separate.
Yeah. There's
Yeah.
the person, which you make personal, and then there's the behavior of the person. And very few people have the opportunity to see the behavior separate than the person.
Yeah. So I was curious to what degree she was actually conscious of that.
Well, for me, by the way, this is what we normally do when you're not here talking about it
Yes.
afterwards. So you're with us right now, which is great.
I love this.
But so what I saw is, and when we were interacting with Vera-lee, I saw that she was very conscious of that.
Yes.
The one thing I wasn't sure with you, and I still don't know completely, is there is a degree to which you will speak in terms of not overly victimhood of this guy, but there is a degree to which there's still something there, which I can't tell what it is, but it's almost like, oh, he's a beautiful man, and this is experience that was part of my life, and I'm joyous that I had that. And not that it needs to be that, but there's an aspect of that that I didn't
Yeah.
necessarily recognize, and I don't care. Not like I'm not healing the world. It's just something that I process. The woman that killed my mom, you right, at 18, I had at some point I really had such a compassion for her that I wrote her a letter of apology for not seeing her all those years. And that's the level of compassion that I often see. That's when I feel really free in myself, and I couldn't necessarily see that or recognize it, and I didn't ask. It wasn't, I also don't want anyone on the show to feel like they need to be anything different than they are, because that would be arrogant and ignorant in a lot of ways. So yeah.
Would you like me to talk to that very
Yeah, I would love
quickly?
it. Why not? It's great.
Yeah. So
We'll
when
continue over,
I
by the way. We're over, but that just doesn't really matter right now. We just go. Yeah.
yeah, cool. So when I talk about moments in time, I put myself back in those moments in time so that the audience understands what emotional state I was in then. And I'm still very connected to that emotional space. However, I went through a journey of forgiveness, and I tried and tried and tried to forgive for so many years this man who there was still some love there. It's not like he was an evil person all over. Like, there was still a human being in there. There was still the man that I fell in love with. What I struggled with the whole time was how much he chose that behavior to deliberately hurt myself and, as a result, my child. And there's a very interesting
Can I interrupt?
photographic.
Can I interrupt you there? Sorry. Just so this is where I would, and we're doing it something that we don't normally do on the show. So let's just get to. So I get triggered when I hear you say that. When I say triggered, I'd say a thing comes up for me is that I would also make an assumption that he was so incapable that he could not have chosen. That in a way, and that's the assumption I make, right? I'm owning it fully, right? And so because of whatever his background, he doesn't even have an alternative in his mind, because he's almost animalistic on one level. So that's just to own it with you, so that now I show full transparency of where I'm at. Yeah.
I appreciate that transparency, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because many of us make those assumptions. And let's be honest, I made that assumption to believe that that was the case for a long time as well, because that was what he was feeding me. And it was coming out of that space and having the ability to look back again from a different perspective. And I talk about perspective a lot.
Yeah.
To look back and recognize that, hang on a minute, all these other times and situations, he was able to behave. This behavior did not surface. And when I put it back together and I looked at the patterns, every time I started to assert my own independence, every time that I started to say no to certain things and situations and whatever it was, every time that I took my own car out to do something that I needed to do that he didn't have full control over, this is when these behaviors were surfacing. And so it was being able to look back and recognize, again, he made a choice to allow himself to get into that state. And so,
okay. So if I may touch on that one.
Yeah.
So now we're in agreement again, because in a way, the trigger for him, which you just said was his loss of control, was for me what I was actually pointing at earlier, was that at those moments that he was incapable, acting out, raging, all that stuff. By the way, let's get one thing clear. I'm not justifying his action. I'm not in any way saying it's acceptable. In fact, I'm saying that I don't care where it comes from. It's unacceptable, period. And
Mm.
yet I see I don't have to heal you. I don't have to understand you or justify it, because I don't even want to make that whole crazy thing. And yet I leave you because the behavior, period, is just unacceptable. And I see it's triggered at times that you lose control. And I don't care if it's a decision or if it's implicit. Like, I wouldn't even have that thought in my mind. I just say it is the behavior that's unacceptable. Where it comes from, who cares? I mean, on one level, we could psychoanalyze it, but on another level, it's just, it doesn't really matter. So that's owning it again with you, just to share with you how I kind of experience that outside of choice or not choice, I guess. That's the, yeah.
I hear you. And I ask you a question in response
please.
to that. If this loss of control only ever happens behind closed doors, when the same situation is presented around other people and that behavior does not exhibit itself, do you still now agree that there is no control over that behavior behind closed doors?
I would say control or not control isn't the area that I'm looking at. Under what conditions does he lose control? And what the implication I'm assuming comes back is that Andy, when he was in social context, he could manage it.
Correct.
And when he wasn't in social context, he could no longer manage it. So
not to, correct.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing I can't say chose, and I don't use that word, and nor do I say I don't want to invalidate experience, right? I can only speak from my own experience. Is that I see in others that the behavior is often a byproduct of the environment they're in and their inability within themselves. So in some ways, yes, he could have chose. Yes. And on another way, he maybe had no choice at all because he had so much rage inside of him all the time, because God knows what his backstory would have been, that it was only in times when he felt safe enough, as stupid as that might sound, to let it out. Does it justify it again? No. But that's the feeling. So in a way, I have compassion for him and complete and utter not acceptance of behavior at the same time.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
If I look at Bambos, by the way, sorry if I continue. If I look at Bambos is your husband to some degree, as I know him. Like, he knew how to manage it out. He knew how to manage it outside, and then he would rage in the moments in the house, up throwing the house, what do you call it? Just ransacking the house. And in some ways, I think if I were to ask you, right, like, did you feel like you were choosing to be who you were when you raged? I don't know. Would you say you had a choice then? Or was it like a chemical thing? I don't know. It's a question for him, actually.
I was going to say, why don't we ask?
It was reactive and very blind, but I also did it in public.
Okay, you did it in public as well. So that doesn't validate the point. Yeah.
No, but of course, you can't say that because there's different people.
No, understood.
Yeah.
I just had the impression that you had some social, but it doesn't really matter, actually. No. Yeah.
Like I said, I didn't have a problem with
I don't know. It's a fine line. And I would say this. Actually, the more I hear you speak, the more I can say I'll trust your experience over anything that I'm speaking towards. Because what I'm also hearing as I speak to you is that, and it's not necessarily assumption in some levels, it's more like a felt experience, and it's how I've gone through life. My dad was bipolar, and when he took his drugs, he would be just fine. But then he felt lifeless because it took away all of the peaks and the things that he felt life. So he went off those drugs to feel alive again. And then in feeling alive, he destroyed everyone else's life because that's how he let out the emotions that he had suppressed. So I could also argue, Dad, you chose to go off those drugs. And by choosing to go off those drugs, you didn't take responsibility for the repercussions of that.
There is an element of that you could go down. And I think this is a really interesting discussion that we could go on for hours.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
I love it too.
I think it's a new show.
It could be, but it's fascinating because I like to dig into these subjects because we're getting to free will. at the end. And the question is, what is free will? And we haven't touched that really big. We've never touched that one on the show yet, but that's really what we're touching on. Do we have free will? And then and obviously that's a really biggie to add on to a hour-long show already.
Yeah. Look, I think that there is, I mean, when I say he chose to behave that way, he picked and chose when that behavior was going to come out. Perhaps it is about that safe space. And I actually talked a lot to people. I know a number of people on the autism spectrum, and I know that they seem to hold it together when they're, out doing their daily thing. And when they get home, that's the time when they can let it all go. And that's the safe space when they can just go, ugh, like, that was so hard to get through today.
Yeah.
I still personally, from my experience, and this is the only way that I can talk is from my experience, I still am aware of so many situations and very specific situations where I think initially there was a choice for the behavior. And I do agree that sometimes the feelings and the emotions and the rage got to a level where he wasn't there anymore. And I think I mentioned that at one point, it's like the black hole, like he wasn't there anymore. And I get at that point that perhaps that is not under his control. Perhaps that is not his choice at that point. However, in my experience, it was all the things that led up to those moments that were his choice. And for me, the important part of the journey, or the most important part of my own healing, was understanding that I could forgive this man, and the clinker was, and not forget what was done.
Yeah.
And the reason that was so important to me was because I knew the power of my story. I had been sharing my story in different ways. I couldn't speak the words for a very long time about what happened to me. And so I drew them. I created them in the artwork. And then I wrote them in poetry. And then I finally found my voice to be able to speak those words. And through each of those stages of that journey of finding my voice and being able to talk about my story, many, many, many people were touched deeply by hearing that. And it was not uncommon. In fact, it was almost expected whenever I would go and speak anywhere that I would have a line of people completely red-eyed, tears all still streaming down their face, coming up to me and saying, thank you. By hearing you share your story, I feel now that I have the courage to share mine. And they would start to share that information with me. And that is an amazing level of connection to get to, where people can be so inspired, feel so connected to you, and so empowered, which are the 3 words that we focus on for the podcast for a reason, that my story has that power for people to understand the power of their own story. And I think that when you were mentioning before about you sort of felt like this little bit of a pushback somewhere, or, that there might have been something there, that was probably because I was talking from that point of view when I share my story. And
You shared that. I didn't get a chance to respond to that.
That's okay.
When you did that, then I felt a deep sense of connection to where you were, because I spent a lot of years talking about an experience from the past, not embodying it. And I separated my emotion from it. And I recognized when you spoke about it, that it took me a lot of time to say, oh, wow, I can allow that to feel again and let other people see me in that so that they can heal, and I create space. So as soon as you said that, I immediately resonated with where you were speaking. And I think it took me a lot of maturity, because I had to be as vulnerable as I was then, and and not intellectualize it and show I'm above this anymore, like allow it to be seen as it was. So so I just wanted to make sure to say I very much recognize that, very, very much so. Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear you share that connection to your story and your emotions, because this is how we honor our stories, and this is how we give others the permission to honor theirs. by having that connection still to the emotions and
What's
to
that?
the journey.
There was a point in Andy's book where he's sharing he was driving and he wanted to pee. I've been wanting to pee for 45 minutes.
Oh, really? I actually peed myself in the car, and because I was stuck on a road in LA, and
So if this is gonna go on, I need to go pee.
Vera, this is the first time where like we usually do a little after party where we talk. We're not doing that today. Thank you for being with us. It was really great spending time with you.
It was really nice. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and thank you for using your story to heal so many others. It's really, really beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be asked and to spend this time with you and to bring this story and hopefully continue these conversations with your audience.
Thank you. And you can segue us out. We welcome you to a next episode of
Wonderful Chaos.